Hi, my name's Steve Phillips. I'm the director of the Cal Poly Los Angeles Metropolitan Program in Architecture and Urban Design. We are all kind of shifting to this new kind of world and trying to adjust, and we decided to keep our lecture series running. We have until June, and we're still in school. So our first group is here today, and this was organized by Sarah Hearne as a group of panelists to discuss, I guess, their curatorial and exhibition design and interest in those discourses and some of the recent stuff that's been happening in Los Angeles. And I think probably they'll take the conversation to larger discourses. So, you know, for those of you who don't know us, we're Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, but we're here in Los Angeles and have been here for about 10 years. And we run a small architecture program that has studio design, history theory, practice, and we also have internships, which maybe at some point we can talk about the challenges of having internships when no one's allowed to go to work. So everyone's online, just like in the rest of the world. So they're experiencing that, which has been interesting for the students. About 30 students, I believe most of them are here with us this evening, and we'll bring them in at the end of the event. So I'm going to quickly introduce Sarah Hearne, who will then introduce the rest of the panelists that she's coordinated for tonight's event. And then they have a special plan for us for about an hour. And then we'll kind of join in with a Q&A. And for those of you interested, the Q&A is running. You can type in at the bottom of your screen. There's a little Q&A, and you can ask a question, and we'll have a record of that. And we can also then, we'll bring as many of the students as we can back into the gallery for the Q&A, and also open up to the conversation for anyone who has a question at that point in time. So just to jump right to it, Sarah, who you can see her name over there, Sarah wave. You're just yeah, there you go. So Sarah Hearne's research focuses on architectural authorship, especially in relationship to the histories of technology and media of architectural tools, reprographics, and image circulation. She's completing a doctoral dissertation titled Other Things Visible on Paper, Architectural Writing and Imaging Craftsmanship, 1960 to 1982. Her independent work includes an exhibition and symposium on information management and display in contemporary architectural research titled Fieldwork in 2015 at the University of Technology Gallery in Sydney, where she was a history and theory lecturer. She has worked alongside Sylvia Lavin on curatorial projects, including Everything Loose Will Land at the Mack Center a few years back in 2013, and more recently as an associate curator on The Duck and the Document at Syarx Gallery 2017, and Architecture Itself and Other Myths of Postmodernism at the CCA, Canadian Center for Architecture, very recently, 2018. She was an associate curator of the 2017 Chicago Architecture Biennale with Johnston Mark Lee, and co-edited and the corresponding catalog, Make New History, published by Lars Mueller. She's rejoining us, and well, she's here now at Cal Poly San Luis LA Metro program. She teaches in our history theory program, and she taught prior to that back in 2014. So I'm going to turn this over to Sarah. I should just really quickly, though, also mention, we're going to continue on with our lecture series, and we have one on Thursday with Jenny and Anda French, and then Thursday, the 16th with Lydia Calipoliti, and then the following Thursday with John May as well. So we'll start publishing out that if all goes well with this event, and then there's many more to follow. So I am going to go quiet.
Sorry, so thank you, Stephen, for offering us the platform for this event tonight, and to the Cal Poly LA Metro students who I've had the real pleasure of teaching this semester, and who I hope will find some resonance between this event and the class that I taught. The title for this event is Some Kind of Durations. It's a title that I suspect will resonate in new ways right now. I'm sure everyone's concept of duration and times organization and scheduling has changed somewhat in these last weeks. but the title was borrowed initially from the art historian George Kubler's book, The Shape of Time, first published in 1962. The book examined the continuity and repetition of formal problems over time, where works were no longer considered in isolation, but as one variation in an ongoing sequence of conceptual problems, and where architects with talent were no longer the originator of singular ideas, but a well-timed individual who entered the field of production with a set of available possibilities. I think about this framing of duration in relationship to the two temporary installations we're discussing tonight that shared a few weeks of being up, being installed, at the same time, and even less if you consider that Michelle's work was designed to never really have a state of finish, perhaps, and arguably so was Anna's. There is more that connects the two installations than this, because they allow us to think about the way that architects organize their design process, such as schedules, Gantt charts, or design phases, in order to move an idea out of the office and into the numerous other hands necessary for construction. And even what it means to design and oversee an institutional construction site, such as a university gallery or a car park. So the format for our event tonight will be a brief presentation from our three presenters, followed by a panel discussion and a Q&A. We're going to start the event with Jia Gu, who will discuss the open call initiated in 2019 at the Materials and Applications by Materials and Applications, titled Staging Construction. This was an open call that observed a diverse set of practices by architects who were considering the conceptual potential of building construction. Jia will be followed by Michelle Chang, whose installation and event series titled Scoring Building was the inaugural commission for this call that was put out by Materials and Application and ran from January 18th to February 29th this year. And following this, we will have Anna Neimark present her exhibition at SCIARC titled Rude Forms Among Us, an installation designed to house vintage prints by naturalist photographer Eugene Truteau that are housed at the Natural History Museum, normally in Toulouse. And this was a collaboration with Frédéric Galliard, who is the head of the photo library there. And now I'd just like to introduce our three respondents or presenters tonight. First, we have, and this is running in the order of presentations, Jia Gu, who is the director and curator at the Materials and Applications, which is a local LA institution that puts on events and programming and installations. She also co-directs the practice Spina Gu with Maxi Spina, among many other things. She's also a colleague of mine at the UCLA doctoral program, and someone I often will speak with about curating architecture and a lot of the questions that we're looking at tonight. We will then have Michelle Chang, who is an assistant professor of architecture at Harvard GSD, and she also directs a private practice, Yaya Code. Am I pronouncing it right? Is it Jad? You're muted. Okay.
Jaja.
Thank you. So, which was founded in 2014. Michelle's work I came across when working on the Chicago Biennial. Even though her practice was founded much earlier, I've very much appreciated her interest in conceptual practices, and she works in a very intermediate way. She looks at film, installation, music, and these issues around construction as well. And then finally, we have Anna Neimark, who is a co-principal of First Office, a practice co-founded with Andrew Atwood in 2011. Anna is also faculty of Design and Visual Studies at SCIARC and has worked and written much and has an ongoing project around the prehistoric form of the dolmen. So today we'll be looking at one iteration of this ongoing research that she's been undertaking for a very long time, and I'm actually very excited to speak about this particular instance of that longer timeline. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jia, and then Jia will turn it over to Michelle, and then finally we will turn it over to Anna, and then we will open up for our conversation. So I'm handing it over.
I think this is, Sorry, bear with me. Okay, does this look clear? Great. Yeah, okay, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for organizing this, and Stephen for hosting this with the Cal Poly LA Metro program. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the conceptual origins of staging construction, which was an open call for projects we actually sent out in 2017 and took 2 years to finally arrive at, or maybe 3 years even, and which Michelle Chang's installation Scoring Building was the finalist for. At M&A, we're a really small operating team that tries to work critically and collaboratively around exhibition making. And so the open call was initiated in a conversation with our programming team, the Contemporary Council of Materials and Applications, which at that time was comprised of Gary Fox, Zach Porter, Lida Aguirre, Melina Girardi, James DeWalt, Dami Oluwoshi, and Emma Price. Staging construction was something between a call for projects and a curatorial brief, setting up some conceptual frameworks we knew we wanted to engage with while also soliciting a project for exhibition. The first line of the open call kind of says it all for us. Staging construction is a call for projects that explore construction as both a practice and a performance. So we really want to think about construction as a set of procedural acts that architects are engaged with, but also a kind of durational space that challenges some of the presuppositions we might have about the nature of architectural installations. And we want to think about construction not just as the execution of an idea or a foregone conclusion, but as a site where architectural reflection can also happen. The idea for staging construction actually came from a funny experience we had with the installation The Kid Gets Out of the Picture, which Anna was also a part of with First Office. That's her dolmen on the left. This was co-curated with, at the time, my co-director, Courtney Kaufman, and the architect team, the Los Angeles Design Group. So I don't know if you remember the project, but it was an extremely large installation that took up the entirety of the site. And a funny thing happened during the construction of the work, which was that we didn't know where to put any of the materials while the site was getting constructed. And it caused a bit of problems for us and our neighbors who weren't too happy with their storefront becoming like a cinder block wall. Because while the installation itself was designed, the staging of the construction wasn't, or at least it wasn't intentional. It was kind of maybe intentionally left to an ad hoc decision making. And so we were really interested in forefronting the stage of architectural labor, designing the process that leads up to the built thing, or if not designing it, maybe choreographing it, or heightening it as an event, or thinking about that role of the exhibition in making that visible. And we especially wanted to highlight projects that were thinking about these back of house concerns for architects, projects that, that could think critically about it. Let's say, I think one thing we sort of took for granted was that construction practices were things that architects were doing on that were engaging with on a daily basis, and that these were kind of habitual procedural ways of doing things that were not usually opened up to interpretation. It's more like something you just kind of do. And so we wanted to make connections between construction practices, architecture, and projects that were thinking about these types of issues from a critical and self-reflective way. For example, thinking about our indebtedness to the flow and disruptions of a global material supply chain, which of course these days is not just an architectural problem, but a kind of public health crisis. We were also thinking more internally about the nature of our own work as an institution that produces architectural installations, and the nature of architectural installations more broadly. So M&A's mission is to present new ideas in art and architecture through built work, and this is a mission I steward as a director. We take this idea quite seriously. We use the term to build very literally. We are about producing built projects that can contribute to expanding and provoking public conversations in architecture. And to a certain extent, M&A's history has always been to resist this, quote, gallerification, unquote, of architecture by producing projects that exist outdoors in open air and in the public. On the other hand, in the era of Instagram, the installation is also subject to a lot of valid critique about its passive and consumerist model of temporary architecture. So, this project by LADG emerged the same time as the Museum of Ice Cream, and they were both the same color. So we were also really interested in how we could maybe slow down the installation as a consumable good, how to challenge some of the expectations an installation might solicit, and how to think about installation as a performance. The three finalists for the call were Team Stephen Chodorowski and Michelle Chang. There was a lot of intense and very positive debate about each of the projects. I won't really go into that. And in the end, we chose Michelle to, let's say, realize the call. I think that's my cue to turn over the presentation to her and to have her speak about her project Scoring Building that I think she will share.
Thanks, Gia. And thanks, Sarah and Stephen, so much for putting this together. I wanted to hear the juicy gossip about the decision, but maybe that's for another time. And I have to just thank M&A. For those of you, maybe many in the audience know about M&A because it's so local, but there aren't many institutions like this, if any, in the US, where young architects get the chance to really experiment and to test out ideas in their early practice. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. So Scoring Building took up the call to, I guess, consider the capacity for design to engage practices and performances within already the profession or the discipline of architecture. And I think there was this other aspect to it, which is how can, let's say, foregrounding some of those aspects of architecture take some of the heat off of the design of the object, which I took to be like a really interesting challenge. For my proposal, and ultimately the thing that got built, I, with a team, there are probably about 5 people working on this. The credits are on my website, but got really into different kinds of notations to develop what was called a kind of score. So one level of notation was called from a series of material specification manuals. So for example, anytime you buy a product, there's also an attendant manual that tells you how to apply it, how to use it, what are the limitations, how toxic is it, etc. So that is sort of played up on the right. So for example, USG J3716 is from the Gypsum Association, how to put gypsum board together. Another layer of the system of site markings that are typical to laying out a project, basically like the kind of lay down. And that was thinking about snapping chalk lines, staking flags in the ground, inscribing circles. How can already within construction a system of drawing be conflated with the kinds of drawings that we do? So that's more the drawing on the left. And then there's a couple more, which I'll show you in a minute. One having to do with a typical construction schedule, and then another having to do with time-based materials. So the proposal for Scoring Building was to use the language existing in these specifications and kind of exaggerating the language to create a pavilion. For example, you'll see in the essential building notes on the right, and you'll just kind of notice this if you look at specification manuals, there aren't any dimensions ever mentioned. Everyone's trying to push their own product. So something like 4x8 will be one sheet of gypsum product. So there are all these like ridiculous exaggerations and formal constraints based on that coding. So the second or the third level of notation was around typical project management scheduling. Generally, I would say a lot of projects are in this realm, what's called activity-based scheduling. This is a Gantt chart where to manage a project, you separate actions according to trades. There's another kind of scheduling that's most typical for very repetitive types of buildings. The Empire State Building is one example, called location-based scheduling. So instead of organizing a project according to discrete labor tasks, you organize the project into a series of time and place-based flows. So if you look at the lines, you're always trying to make these continuous lines happen to be efficient. So all of that has to do with like how you organize the design of a building through a kind of temporal order, which I found super fascinating. I ended up like going down a rabbit hole of all of this and found these sort of best practice manuals from the Department of Defense. And so they list all of these what's called common time robbers. And all of this is for the sake of efficiency. I thought for this project and in architecture, some of these common time robbers are directly linked to architectural imagination. Shifting priorities, demand for short-term results, desire for perfection, vague goals and vague goals and objectives. I think that's exactly what we do. And that pause or those kinds of delays are oftentimes productive. So the project that I kind of set up in response to the call was how to like really maximize and exaggerate these notations and these sort of instructions. With that, I would say like a really big driver, aside from that initial drawing of the ground markings, was the design of the schedule. This was done in the location-based modeling kind of software that I was showing you before. So on the left axis, it's time. On the vertical, and on the horizontal axis, it's space, basically. So if we look here, there's a kind of repetitive phasing of a series of instructions done over and over again. And at some point, that's all undone to disassemble the project. So in this way, like the sort of durational and spatial aspect was much like a musical score. With the materials, I thought, one of the challenges was how to make something so systematic and dry, I don't know, at least enjoyable on an aesthetic level. And looking into some of the common materials for markings, both the chalk and, building of walls, I found a couple of things. One, there is a system of codes already within materials having to do with levels of permanence. So if you look at just sort of chalk, there is a whole color spectrum ordered to levels of permanence. Lavender is least permanent. It's for dusting off, like for making decks. And red is the most permanent. So if you are on a high traffic surface, you use a red chalk line. There is something like this, which is like materials that use time indicators. This is called Drydex time indicator. Goes on pink, dries white. So much of the project has to do with following these sets of instructions around inscribing and building typical sort of walls over and over again, using these materials to achieve sort of aesthetic effects. but also to create a pavilion of 4 rooms. So I'm just going to show you some photos. This is the outside of it. It's almost like the awning that's very, very tightly inscribed to the site. The site is at the Mackey Apartments in LA. It's very tight. And then typical sort of stud construction, I think, was made a little bit more raw through the sort of color coding and the revealing of these material affects. Here is the set of instructions repeated over and over again to produce a kind of enfilade, a series of nested rooms. That kind of marking was, repeated over and over using different chalk colors depending on what was being done. And then finally, because most of the budget was spent on the labor, because basically it was a 6-week installation that probably could have been done in half the time. But because it was a sort of performative installation, the builder was asked to slow down. So one of the things that was done to sort of make the pavilion work, but also to maximize some of these construction techniques, was to develop a set of details using these like most basic elements to form connections. So you'll kind of see the top track being fastened to another top track in a sort of weird way. I think all of that, to close this out, is not so much about an obsession of notation, but how can reconsidering building construction as a performance produce, or kind of, let's say, allow me to think about typical architectural elements in different ways. So in the end, I think this was all just a kind of pavilion with a weird window and an extended threshold. And that was really productive for me. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks to Stephen for organizing, to Sarah for inviting everybody. Of course, to Michelle for being like a very good friend and somebody with whom Andrew and I are constantly in conversation. And then Gia, of course, she's already shown, and I'll kind of show that slide again, for also being one of the first kind of people to invite us to build something in LA. So definitely M&A. For kind of being part of our city and for organizing lots of events. So it's really nice to be here. It was really awesome actually to see that Michelle and I had installations going on in LA at the same time. And we kind of caught up a little bit today, and mine is indoors and hers is outdoors. So I thought maybe they're kind of like pets, that you have, like an indoors cat and an outdoors dog or something. But anyways, probably similar size and similar a little bit in terms of their posture. They're kind of like broken boxes. And we can probably come back to that a little bit, because I think that's something to do with the fact that these things are in LA. And, there's a little bit of a lineage, I guess, associated with that. But I'll talk a little bit about this particular project. And you see on the left is the installation of a small house, and on the right, a kind of zoom in of a shot with your back to the dolmen looking at the photographs. So the project is in 2 parts, and it's both an exhibit of these photographs, as Sarah mentioned, with a collaborator from Toulouse, Frédéric Gaillard, and then this project on the left. Of course, First Office is a little bit kind of a team collaborate. We worked with I call Austin the master builder, Rob, and actually not in the picture, Kong, worked with us the summer to help design this thing. And then Ben, of course, who kind of thought through the construction process. And we all kind of built it together, well, mostly the three of them. But we tried to reconstruct this picture in that shot of construction. And of course, today's topic a little bit also because of some of the interests that Michelle and I have is about kind of looking under the hood of the car maybe, and, you know, talking a little bit about the bones and the details of certain things. But anyways, to just kind of introduce the dolmen a little bit, it's a megalithic monument. It's not just one, but they're like millions probably built, but what remains probably in the thousands all over the world. Some of the particular ones that I looked at, or that Andrew and I have been looking at, are from about 4000 BC, so 6,000 year-long gap. In a way, to kind of Sarah's initial question of duration, this is probably the longest span that we have kind of to consider that's at the table today. And I've always been fascinated by these things because you know, they're almost like these kind of primitive huts that are out there in the landscape, and they kind of produce a little bit of an uncertainty about what to do with them, both from the point of view of a kind of disciplinary object, but also a kind of prehistoric form. Do they belong to architecture? Do they belong to nature? Do they belong to landscape? Do they belong to humankind? I guess I'm kind of with the fourth, but certainly these scale figures are not quite certain how to drive one of these things. I guess the way in which, as an architect, we might look at it is a little bit through the structure. There are vertical kind of stones that hold up a large capstone. So I always thought that it was kind of nice to make this kind of, at least a vocal connection between the domino and the dolmen, and simply to say that there is a kind of structural, maybe parallel that we could begin to develop with some very distinct differences. Of course, there are things that hold up other things. The structure is inset slightly, just like in the domino. There is a kind of exposed and over, you know, a kind of exposed roof, maybe even a roof deck. But the differences are also distinct in that, at least in the way in which we can begin to look at the dolmen, there are certain qualities that become immediately apparent, as in their posture in relationship to the ground, or maybe even the texture of the stone and the kind of roughness or rudeness of that. So root stone monuments was a kind of term that is quite kind of important, I guess, to the work, because it's a technical term that implies that the stone is not hewn, it's not cut by a kind of architectural technological process, but is a kind of found object a little bit. And so rudeness, in the way in which I use the word in the title of the exhibition, refers to this as a kind of not hewn but rude stone. But then when we go beyond the structural, we can also begin to talk about a kind of structuralist, maybe parallel as well. If Eisenman looks at a kind of domino to begin to talk about a system of the syntax that emerges among the kind of columnar order, of the pilotis, the floor plate and the stair, I think that among the dolmens, we can talk about something quite a bit, well, similar in the way that perhaps these diagrams are constructed, but different in the way in which authorship might begin to be constructed, in that there isn't so much a kind of matrix of a kind of measured systematic understanding of these part-to-whole relationships, but rather the idea of a kind of global, multiplication of almost like the same object over and over again by many different peoples. And so on every continent, in many different prehistoric kind of, it's hard to say countries, of course there wasn't such a thing, but whatever it was, societies, communities, villages, these objects would have existed and would have in a way brought people together simply in their construction. So to go back to what Michelle was saying, like the construction and the duration and the kind of maybe choreographing of something, in my mind would have produced a kind of community or collaboration back in the day as well. So that's been fascinating. And of course there are many kind of iterations in the work of First Office of some of the interpretations of these things. simply because the fact that they're prehistoric and outside of our modern time, we kind of think of a potential to kind of almost collapse that time into the present. And so, when taken a little bit out of context and through maybe contemporary modes of construction, these things fall very immediately into sort of 2020 mode. There isn't this idea that they somehow fall back into history for us. And so this was a proposal with Andrew Atwood that we developed for PS1. This was another version of that picture that Gia showed, where the dolmen appears in LA for the first time, but as a kind of model, three-legged, one-sided dolmen, and then the kind of model for the exhibition at SCI-Arc. And so this one is also based on a kind of loose plan of a very small house, something that would probably fit neatly into a backyard, something like an accessory dwelling unit. And so this, goes back to maybe the interest of M&A being a kind of backyard or a kind of in-between space. And so I wonder quite a bit about that relationship to a gallery that's outdoors, and my interest in kind of thinking of SCI-Arc's gallery as something that begins to open up a little bit, and its walls begin to kind of produce a little bit of a backdrop for something that could be an exterior building. But in any case, this is a kind of plan that got squeezed into this very long gallery. And then on the right, you see the longer dashes for the location of the photographs. My collaborator, Madame Gaillard, she comes from Toulouse, and here you see her at work. She brought these beautiful 19th century negative prints from Eugène Truita that depict the kind of the photograph of the dolmen as a kind of portrait of you. And I always thought it was beautiful that the first time she sent me this picture was with the background of the giraffe. Her husband is the taxidermist in the Natural History Museum. So there's a kind of very almost like very near relationship, let's say, in the way in which in this museum, or at least in the kind of museum or in the kind of world of natural history, one begins to encounter oneself as a kind of human among many other things within the collection of the kind of natural world. And then I wanted to maybe try at least, and maybe that won't work, but show a little bit about the construction. So we worked with the material, which is a structural insulated panel. And it's a kind of like ice cream sandwich that basically builds up through a series of these large objects that, not unlike, I guess, stones, sit one on top of the other. And so maybe what you missed in some of those videos that didn't play was the idea of kind of laying out the landscape and measuring out the site. And some of the things that Michelle and I will certainly talk about a little bit later, how to begin to understand the kind of context and the way in which we begin to translate, let's say, a drawing into a series of kind of strokes, and then tape, and then screws, and then walls, and then roofs, et cetera, et cetera. So like a kind of inscription of the project into the gallery space. And then, of course, also not only its inscription, but also its finish and kind of material finish, and thinking also about, in this case, Ben is looking at a bunch of paint tests, trying to understand the way in which we can begin to make affinities with the materials that are already present in the gallery. So in this case, the concrete floor and its kind of greenish hue that we wanted to begin to take on, so that the monument seemed, or the kind of house seemed to take on some of the qualities of the concrete. And these are photographs by Joshua White. Their team kind of exaggerated saturation a little bit, but the walls were slightly pink, the monument was slightly green, and then the walk through the house reveals some of those views and details. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody for those incredible presentations. And I have about 1 million questions that I have to now kind of put into an order. And I suspect that what's going to happen is there is so much to discuss. I think we're all aware of resonances that we could probably have a discussion without necessarily having me lead, but just to kind of start us off. I was actually quite struck by, it's the last thing I'm thinking of, so it's the first thing in my head. And are you talking about a sort of site specificity about the way you approached the SciArt gallery and the sort of sampling of the colours on the wall and thinking about that? It actually made me start to think about installation as a practice and some of these art historical terms around site specificity, which of course as architects is something we've for the most part, if we have a specific site rather than a kind of conceptual idea, we know how to work with sites and we know how to think about them specifically in the way we design. But I guess it would be interesting to hear you all three speak a little bit about this question of site and the approach as design, because in a certain way, you know, we're talking a lot about the sort of circulation of material and the coordination of those materials in the instruments of architecture's organization. But this question of the site is really the place where, say, a construction site that is coded and, you know, by OSHA and, you know, it has a certain way of kind of bringing you down to the kind of, you know, the site. In a way, you both were dealing with an institutional context, but I guess thinking about construction sites and sites that you were working in might be a good way to start opening up the point between an architect and someone who is constructing the design. So if you guys could respond to this kind of idea of site specificity in relationship to your work and these ideas of the conceptual ideas around construction and construction sites.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about site. It's one of the things I was looking forward to talking about, so this is great. And maybe I want to like sort of encourage dialogue. Ask Anna about what constitutes like the site, or maybe if the word should be context that you're drawing from, or like, because I think there's like one way of thinking about the work that is more about construction or code, but there's the other, which is the importance of the history of the dolmen, the almost like the mysticism surrounding that sort of narrative, and the relationship of the dolmen to the landscape in that it's actually made from the ground. And so like I think the issue of site for that project is like a very rich one, and unlike maybe my project is less about, or can be said to be less about the coding.
No, I mean, I'm trying to figure out how to even begin to answer, because there's the site, I guess, of the dolmen in Toulouse, which is like a hill next to a couple of roads and the intersection that probably the yellow vests took over and had a party next to when it rained, you know. And then there is the site of the gallery, which has its own constraints, meaning that its floor is not flat. And Austin pointed out that the only 90-degree angle in the entire gallery was an expansion joint in the concrete floor that we had to kind of measure everything off. And then, of course, there is the site or the context of everything that came before us in that gallery and everything that will come after. And all of those things, I guess, are kind of pushing on what we do, right? I wonder what, Michelle, what is the difference between site and context for you? How do we define those terms even? I'm trying to think like etymologically speaking, context with text, with legibility, within a kind of, I guess, historical meaning versus site as something that is a little bit more physical and situated, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know if this answers it, but for some reason, when you were presenting your project, I kept thinking of the word exegesis, which is about like text, right? Mm-hmm. Which is like you're trying to, like, I was thinking, is she trying to analyze and kind of just like sort of bring forth something within the dolmen through the design of these objects. Because like you showed the M&A one, there's the model of the thing, there's the PS1 thing, and then there's like the one that you showed, which is really beautiful. They're all like amazing. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is there is the kind of story or somehow the ways in which dolmen are represented along with the landscape that I think is part of what I'm reading as what you're drawing from.
I mean, here I might answer differently from how Andrew might think about it, because the things that attract me so much about these structures has to do with all of the mysticism surrounding them. And that's not something that we would have been prepared to talk through in the relationship to how we were educated, for example. Like, I can talk about formal analysis, I can make puns and talk about informalities and informal analysis and like site analysis, et cetera, but I don't necessarily know how to explain the giants or the myth of the giants who had constructed these dolmens, and the kinds of anthropologists who would have talked about the fact that the Smithsonian Museum burned the archive that would have proven some of these theories, and that somehow there's another layer, I guess, of story telling that is kind of embedded in some of these structures. And to me, those things are super important, almost of equal importance as maybe the story of how this may or may not relate to Peter Eisenman's writing. I'm not quite sure how to almost like level out those narratives in my own mind, but for sure, when we encounter some of these things, it's kind of impossible not to think of ourselves as simply as human beings, and think about our own mortality, and think about kind of the presence of time, or being in the presence of time, and what that might actually mean for us as architects, for whom everything seems to be so much about schedules and events and, you know, like efficiencies. And even like when we talk about collaboration, it just seems to be about something that moves very quickly and effectively. And then this thing is so non-affected.
Do you think that just makes me think that I wonder if this is why this might be the appeal of the photograph, because in a certain way the photograph timestamps and fixes it in a way into an industrial system of production, but also we understand the history of photography in a certain way where we can also start to think about repetition of photography, which I know is something that, Michelle, you're also interested in. But I was thinking of this kind of issue of repetition, because you pick the dolmen that's already multiple, right? Like, and then the photography then allows you to kind of multiply out, you know, this issue of repetition and industrial repetition, not a sort of magical or kind of sort of unknown or immeasurable, or maybe it's a sort of something that doesn't fit within the timeline, let's say. Photography allows you to start speaking about it in a more industrial and organized sort of way. I'm wondering, I don't know, I mean, that's what I'm kind of thinking about, because I keep returning to the difference between the dolmen and the photographs.
That's right.
What's important about the photographs then in that way?
You're right, because I mean, there is the thing in there is the 19th century technology as opposed to something like a 6,000-year-old technology. And that is very like immediate and quick and high resolution and reproducible and so on and so forth. Probably that technology is much closer to how we work today in architecture. I mean, it is like the kind of the equal to the thing in the room. And in many ways, to be clear, I never actually visited this thing. So when I talk about it, and I talk about it in some sort of poetic, like poetic way, as if there's some aura about this thing. I actually was raining, and I was half an hour away, and I just didn't make it out there. I just went back to the archive and flipped through some more photographs that day. So for all the desire that I have to be close to this thing, the photograph is as close as I got. And maybe that also puts a little bit of pressure on this question of the site. Like Michelle, and this, I would love to ask you also, if I may, like, there are many times that architects work that they don't actually visit the site, and they don't maybe even necessarily are present in the space in which this construction takes place. You know, there's a lot of stuff for us. You know, this Zoom meeting is nothing new. It's how most of architecture gets built, anyways. But you went out of your way. I mean, you really went out of your way to come to LA multiple times and to be present, personally present. I mean, this is like the king visits the construction site. You know, it's like the architect on the construction site, you know, orchestrating some sort of, I wonder about, I guess, the body of the architect and the kind of physical presence, mm-hmm. and actually being on the site, conducting a bit. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So maybe you can speak a little bit about that, the kind of multiple presence and the,
yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, like, I think, so less logistically and more about the role of the architect being on site. Yeah, I mean, I feel gross about that, actually. I don't want to be the king, but I don't know. Yeah, I have to think about that. Like, so let me start from an honest place, which is that I thought the project was so inscrutable on many levels that I would have to come and talk. I mean, you saw the drawings and the schedule. Like, intense obsession with coding is all well and good, until maybe there's like a degree of confusion and it becomes way outside of the realm of the project, which didn't really happen because the builder, Bob Dornberger, was wonderful and totally, he's an artist and a builder at the same time. So he completely got it. He was like, solo-it building? Yeah, I get it. But so there's that aspect of, I think, one, communication on site is incredibly important. Architecture is always like plans plus specifications, or communication plus drawing in my mind. And so I think that, to me, was part of the reason why I had to be physically present. The other was, I mean, the project is not only the physical thing, the project is also the programming and the timing and the audio recording that was associated with it. So, and maybe Gia can talk about this too, participant in me being there was like a programming event that I was associated with, and then I had to come back. Like, the weird constraint of the project is everything had to happen multiple times. So I think that's a little bit of it too. And that was, I think, a little bit challenging in the project in a productive way, which is like, because it was an installation set around this timeline and everything had to repeat, we had to consider what all goes into an architectural installation and how can we do that like 3 times.
Well, I was just thinking that there wasn't a site when you proposed the project. Mm-hmm. And yeah. We actually didn't even have a site when we selected you to do the project, and we kind of thankfully found a site with the Mac Center as their courtyard. And for us, it was nice because it institutionally mirrored many of the other conditions that we have produced our exhibition projects. But I wonder if you could talk to that kind of new, I don't know if constraint's the right word, that a site is a constraint, but that your project had to float in no container in a way and then suddenly enter a container.
Yeah. I mean, this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. I did this installation in the GSD library too, that I think is just like really similar. I mean, this is probably really well tread territory, but it didn't matter to me that there was no site, because the system was always responding to like an imaginary site, and the system was so flexible. So in a way, I still think of this as site specificity, but I like to think of this as like a field recording. Like the scoring building, when it was proposed, was the square with the circles inscribed. It being put in the courtyard of the Mackey apartments, that it had to get squished, but then, you know, the set of drawings and the multiplication of all the parts still persisted and became as site specific. In the example in the library, it was just, how do you read the image of the existing, whatever it is, the image of the library, to produce a condition that can only exist in that place. But that same process could be anywhere. So, I mean, I think that was like what I really liked about the competition that I've been thinking a lot about since then, which is, if I care less about the form of the thing, if I don't design the form of the thing, then what happens? And so I guess, I mean, Michael Hayes would call this the aleatoric aspect, but that to me is still site specific.
What's aleatoric?
The random, right? The randomness happens through
aleatoric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It looks random, but it is actually highly specific according to that set of rules that gets played out. So,
I think, Gia, did you want to say something?
No, you ask your question and I'll ask.
No, you go next, because I was really just thinking about Stephen's message, but you.
Well, I was thinking, maybe this has to do with the question of photography you were asking, but, you know, like a challenge for the project would state, you know, with Michelle's scoring building, and I know Anna thinks about this a lot also, are sort of the outputs outside the built work. So in you know, more conceptual art practice or performance art, there's almost a shift to resituating the work in the residual documents or artifacts that get produced out of process or performance pieces, whether it's like a script or a photograph of the performance itself as the event that's documented. And so some of the visibility of the work doesn't happen through the immediate experience of the performance in the space of the performance, but some of that experience or some of that understanding of the project happens through the kinds of, I just keep thinking of like residual as the word, that kind of like the things, the artifacts that come out of the process, or the artifacts that are collected towards the process. So Michelle's, you know, a lot of her project is understood partly through the documentation of the built work, but a huge part of it is substantiated through the kinds of images that she showed in our presentation, which were the notational script, the research that happened before the project, even, I mean, you know, and some of the things you showed, Michelle, were less the generators of the project and more as sort of like the, I guess, context. I don't know if context is the word, right? Like not everything you showed was the generated the work itself. It became the artifacts of some other aspect of the work. And I don't know, I mean, Anna, I don't know if that's true of your work, but I'm curious to think about the practices you guys have as ones that are really centered on excavating process, but in excavating process, there also somehow needs to be some other output or artifact that captures or presents the process outside the exhibition.
Can I just jump on that? Because I think I have a similar question, just it's a slight additional end question, which is, if we return to a conversation around the conceptual project, which is where some of these questions emerged, say, in the 70s post-war period, what is the institutional critique then? I guess that's kind of why I was going for site, but like, if we are taking the heat
right? So if postmodernism is a 50-year project after modernism, then we're in the age of post-conceptualism. This is like, this is my 2020 essay, I guess. But, I realized that in the kind of post-conceptual work, the artifact, I guess, of conceptualizing it should be less important than the construction itself. So like, in other words, that some of these artifacts, and Gia, to your question, like, I remember that when we did a project at the Mackey Gallery, we kept our specifications and, you know, made a big deal about the kind of the instructions, I guess. I don't know. I think in this case, much of the work is probably not even written down, which is to say, it was just kind of built. And then most of the stuff, I'd have to go back in my emails or something to dig it up. But I think that my hope would be that, well, twofold. One is that hopefully it's not about the construction of some sort of artificial archive or something, but that rather we can produce a kind of additional essays and like writing surrounding this project. And that's something that's been probably central to the work of First Office throughout the last few years. But then on the other hand, you know, this whole thing is called Battleship House, which is to say it's like the battleship game that can be played multiple times. And so some of these stones and how the closets are arranged, those things can arrange and rearrange themselves on different sites many times. So like very similar to how Michelle talked about working with, you know, kind of pretty standard framing construction, such that maybe what comes out of it is more of a kind of method of planning, like I don't know, plan making, and maybe that's about it. I don't know how precious the kind of process would have to be. I
guess like another way of asking the question. I see Stephen all of a sudden, so I'm going to ask it quick. I think like what Sarah and I are maybe trying to get at is, you know, like in the 70s when there was this enormous output of conceptual work and there was a shift to the non-object and everything that was residual around the production of the object, that was really understood to be a kind of institutional critique in which the artwork being produced could not circulate within the convention and milieus of collecting and blue chip markets and, you know, all of these museum spaces. So it was really understood to also be a kind of institutional critique. And I think outside like the immediate practice of a studio, maybe it's not a question for you guys, maybe it's just a question we can think about over long term, but when we begin to produce such process output through process, I think the question is like, what is the status of those works and what is the status of that output? Like, what is the status of the image that Michelle shows in which she's, you know, it's both a research artifact that she's produced because she's looked through this amazing archive of military thinking and training, and then what is it outside of that, you know? I just think it's an interesting question because you begin to see that, you know, we see that happening a lot, you know, and there's this kind of a lot of this kind of production that's beyond the object, and we don't, you know, what do you do with that production, or what's the role of the production?
Hi. Don't want to.
Can we say something or?
Yeah, I'd love to keep it going now. The conversation is really good, but I kind of also want to keep moving it. So if you guys had an answer to that question, that's great. I mean, I actually just missed a tiny little bit there of Anna's conversation as you're starting to get into, I guess, what I've been seeing in a very coherent discourse among you, which is pretty fascinating and impressive. That one, Sarah's organized this and that you're all working on something, I think, simultaneously, which you keep talking about as sort of, to me, from, I guess, a generational perspective, I keep seeing we were obsessed with design process, and you're almost not so interested in design process. You're all talking about staging and construction process and materiality and technique, and you're analyzing and thinking about these what maybe were historically like more technological materialist discourses. But then I also want to, and I think you do it too, as you brought as Anna kind of brought up with this discussion of mysticism and history and the cultural discourses that are actually underlying your interests in this somewhat hands-on materiality, technology, sequence, the making of a production of something versus the cultural materialism that maybe also is a generational interest, and how those two are kind of hitting at each other in an interesting way. And then I'm wondering why that push, let's say, away from design process towards this, I would call it technocultural materialism, at least that's what I've written about, but I like that, this materiality, technology, almost obsession that happens in all of your work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been thinking about, and this is old school again, but I've been thinking about the Robin Evans translations from drawing to building, and how, like, I recently reread it, how what he says, or what is trying to convey in the piece, which is that at one point he says drawing might be vastly overvalued. And in some points he advocates for direct action and a way, what did he say, of interacting directly with the thing, which is the building. And just sort of rereading is like, God, like the certain discussions or maybe like misreadings of that have foregrounded representation, this role, and this sort of artifact's role as a sort of instrument for design. But like, to me, the answer has to do with like the way he talks about the way certain techniques might open up potentials for interacting with construction directly that would not be afforded through just mere imagination. And to me, that is a more basic interest in really sort of simple things like doors and windows and like shelter. I know that sounds like overly simple given the means, but I think that's what it all gets at. And I'd be curious, like for Anna, if it's something maybe similar. I don't know.
I think so. I think, Stephen, I don't know whether I would separate out completely, like design from, like, on the one hand, process of design versus on the other hand, as you suggested, process of, I guess, technological materialism of sorts. Because I think the way that I see it is that both First Office and Michelle's kind of practice, we're designing through materials. So, like, in many ways, like the kind of process of maybe thinking materially is the way in which we consider the work of designing something. So I'm not sure that those things, and even Robin Evans, like, I don't think that those things are as separate to our work as they are more kind of one. We're just kind of substituting maybe certain material tools into the design process, but it's not like one leads to the other. There isn't a before and an after. There isn't the kind of ontological, there is the design in drawing and then there's the construction in materials. It's literally designing through materials. So
and
it's like,
yeah, and I guess, Sarah, you go.
Well, no, I think that's exactly why I sort of asked about the site as a construction site, because I was thinking of this sort of distinction for Evans, right? That the drawing, the architect doesn't make the building, they make the drawing, and these kind of distinctions between how we organize our work and communicate our work, and then someone else, many other people kind of need to be coordinated to produce the work. But I guess this interest in materials, and not just in materials, but understanding that, say, the materials that you design with and make a model with might be different or potentially similar. Anna, you're building something that's an ice cream sandwich, but you've also talked about it being like foam core.
That's right.
So there's a certain idea that the play of the use of materials is allowing you also to speak about those distinctions and the ways we've divided our work. and to kind of then re-enter something that we've been kind of held apart from in a certain way. If we just make things. Anyway, so I was just thinking about, which I agree. I think this idea of the material allows you to kind of challenge some of those distinctions.
So something I guess it was Mark Cousins once said to me. He said, "Materials resist form," and I always thought that was an interesting kind of commentary. And so it's not that I was suggesting design, of course, isn't part of this technological materialist discourse. And I'm also not suggesting that's what you guys are doing at all. It's just there has been these historic moments when design as a paper architecture or a digital formalist architecture has, even in an Eisenminian culture, has dictated, let's say, the way in which designers proceed and think and create, and that their design process was always very, very important. But then there's always the kickback against those people or that type of thinking, is that then there's the manufacturing, there's the construction, there's the resistance of real material that actually affects and as you guys said, construction, staging, sequencing, all these things, means and methods, actually then kick back against that in some ways that create a dialectic. But I actually think maybe there's something more exciting about what you all are saying, and that's what I guess I'm trying to chase, is that you're also suggesting, which I think is very important to me, is that there's a cultural, political, other aspect that's embedded in the construction, the technology, the materiality of the site, the earth, the dome, and the nature, the history, that you're actually then want to somehow capture back. And that's what I want to put a little pressure on in this conversation, is like, well, what is the cultural relevance of seeking discourse through these material technological expertise that you're chasing? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That's what makes you different than the other, you know?
Does it?
I don't know. Makes you not a paper architect, right? I mean, that's an interesting topic.
I mean, one thing that I always recall what Andrew once said when he was working on something where he was rescaling a model, different sizes, and he kept painting all different models, but with the same paint. And I remember this very clearly. He said, you can't scale paint down. Like, you can scale down whatever kind of details that you have, and you can even make scaled lumber appear as though you're making a fully sized object. But paint has a certain thickness and cannot scale. And if you continue to layer paint, it's going to produce more and more kind of thickness. And there is also this kind of beautiful memory that Le Corbusier writes about, where painting the room, the corners get softer and softer because of the amount of paint, that the room just gets smaller and smaller. And I think that those are the kinds of things that have always fascinated me, which have to do with, what this kind of Russians would have called the factura of materiality, something that has its own kind of intensity and kind of sizable weight, cost, material, I mean, labor. These are all the things, like when you're watching paint dry, it takes a little bit of time, and I think that, you can render a room to be a certain tone, but translating, I guess, that tone into something that has a number and the value associated with it, and the amount of gallons that are necessary. Like, I think that produces a really important kind of aspect to the work, because then at some point you can actually produce an objective value for something as subjective as tone. And I think that is something that we're constantly chasing, trying to understand very loose terms that have to do with tolerance, tone, value, like even posture, but then at the same time having to construct those kinds of things that are a little bit hard to quantify. And yet, as Michelle is pointing out constantly, you have to quantify constantly. And the quantification happens, of course, through like Excel sheets and, like endless emails, all kinds of dollar billios, and, just people and distances traveled and, you know, square footages painted. So it's kind of like, it's just one example. It's just one material. You know, we of course deal with numerous of these things, but it kind of like the depth of questions that can come out of thinking through even one material has been fascinating, and something that perhaps wasn't central to paper architecture. And so, I mean, I guess we're rediscovering some of these things by looking closely at them.
It makes me think of the Time Robbers that Michelle mentioned, this amazing document, but I'm thinking about the things like imagination, or the things that don't neatly fit within a schedule, or, I mean, because I think your interest in the sort of organization and the weight and the measure and the kind of coordination of these things seems to always be to a sort of inefficient end. And so the critique is almost like against progress. I don't know what it is, but like the critique against a sort of, sort of rationalization or whatever it is. I mean, I think that the sort of excess and accumulation seems to be important. And those seem to be time robbers, right? I mean, I think that according to that document.
It's funny because it might also be generational. Like I'm thinking about Anna, your work when I first met you was very much about representation, drawing, and perspective. And there was such a kind of an extreme interest and analysis in that. And then as you started producing with Andrew in the world, it kind of shifted then maybe towards I don't know, you started thinking about paint and really thinking about paint color and how like minuscule changes in paint color were creating spatial environments. And then it started shifting into a different territory with this last amazing exhibition that is very tactile in some ways, even though the forms itself are quite analytic. I don't know. I don't know. Can we get some of the students or someone out there? We actually had a lot of people for a while engaged in this. That's really good. I'd love to hear more. I don't know how we can get them into the conversation, except by me just pulling you out of the puzzle and just putting you into the room, which I don't know if that is okay, because I don't know what you're doing in those rooms, right? I don't know.
Ask questions, no?
Yeah. Do we have any questions out there? I can see if you raise your hand too. I think there's a raising hand thing. All right, I know that Alex is out there. Alex, do you have a question? Now you can talk if you want.
I have a question.
Now you're unmuted. You want to join in?
I don't have a question, but I'm enjoying the conversation.
Okay, anybody else? I got a hand, here we go. Deborah?
Hi.
Let's see if I
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. I'm trying to think if I can get you, you can start asking and I'm gonna work on getting you in here.
Oh my God, okay, let me put my makeup on, right?
No, you can stay. You can be a voice, it's okay.
Okay, yeah, so I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, so I apologize. I mean, I came in somewhere maybe right after the beginning of Michelle's conversation. And one of the things that I have sort of had on my mind throughout these sort of different, looking at these different projects and thinking about these different concepts. I mean, I think in the middle of this sort of being at home thing, one of the first things that I did was started watching movies. And that might not be totally unique to my situation. That might be like across the board. People have just sort of started to watch movies and watch things more than ever. And one of the movies that I watched recently was Midsummer, this like horror movie based in Sweden about some kind of cult, right? But it goes back to the idea of ritual a lot. And I think with both of these projects, I kept thinking about ritual, right? The dolmen is really, really embedded perhaps in a kind of mysterious history of ritual where there's a lot of, let's say, kind of debate over who built these things and why were they built, and for whom. And in a lot of ways, it's both a conversation about ritual and audience. And so for the dolmen, I think over time, we now look back on these objects as much as we look back on maybe Stonehenge or Area 51 is like things that will always be shrouded in a kind of mystery, where space itself, it really doesn't, we can get into them perhaps, but we never really do. And I think Anna's comment about perhaps only maybe accessing the dolmen mostly through the photograph is quite interesting in that regard, in its relation to myth and then ritual. But for both of you, I guess my question would be, when we think about the accessibility to the story, to the narrative, right? We talked about the architect as maybe a director, perhaps would be another way. Who is the audience for these mythologies? And I think for Michelle, for your project, perhaps when we look at construction workers working on a building and we usually pass them in our car or on the sidewalk, when are we given access to these mythologies, or what are the kind of ways in which these structures live in a way that requires that they be shrouded by a certain level of, we could say maybe disappeared history, or we could call it bureaucracy, or we could call it, roadside rules. How much do these projects actually require a level of shrouding? And therefore, could we perhaps maybe not call the architect the master builder, but perhaps the kind of master choreographer, and at times a saboteur of its own accessibility in terms of narrative?
I mean, for me, I'll just maybe I can start. I think you're right on with the kind of ritual aspect. You could call part of that like having to do with craft. But I would say, for me, I don't advocate for that kind of mystery. I like what you were saying. What did you call it? The roadside drive-by?
Mm-hmm.
That's something I've generally just been really interested in with that past installation, scoring building, to prolong that period as much as possible. I mean, like, to me, the ritual has to do with extending like the sort of anticlimax, which I think the most beautiful moment is when you see one of those McMansions getting built, and then it gets built and it's terrible. The framing is always such a wonderful moment, or seeing the structure of building such a wonderful moment. And maybe in that sense, there's a kind of mystery to what the end product or the final outcome or the object will be. But other than that, for me, there's no mystery involved.
Hi, Debbie. It's good to hear from you. Debbie actually worked 5 years ago on the diagram of some of these dolmens that I showed.
Oh.
It's kind of insane. When you say ritual, I can't but help to think of the Passover dinner that we're going to stage at our house tomorrow night, and how much goes into the laying out of all of the symbolic items on the table, and the kind of retelling of the story of the Jews leaving Egypt. And that there is this story that is told in so many contexts over and over again. In case you have never encountered a bunch of Jews, they sit around the table with books and they read from the books the story and interpret what's written, I guess, in the old text. And to me, that's kind of how all the dinners should be. Like, I'd love for that to somehow be part of architecture, that there's only one story to tell. Of course, we haven't maybe had that. We haven't maybe had like slavery. Like, we need something horrible to happen for a ritual to begin to take place, I guess, within our own field. But somehow, to me, architecture would be good enough if we just told the same story over and over again with multiple interpretations. And so what's really amazing about the Passover dinner is that it can be completely reworked for a kind of contemporary audience, and through ways in which we can tell stories of other slaves and stories of other freedoms. And there's a kind of way of kind of bringing a kind of point of view that is very particular to each family. And so I think that I guess in my mind, architecture could be a little bit more like that. And I'm not sure if that speaks to Michelle in any way, but only to say that I could do the same thing over and over again and just slow things down, and that I would be very happy with that. And so in many ways, I'm kind of trying to understand how we could stand still and interpret the same action over and over again, rather than produce kind of newness and produce things outside of ritual. So I mean, if Michelle thinks that she's conservative and invoking like
Robin Evans,
I'm like the most conservative. I'm like and then here standing in the desert, black monolith.
No, I mean, I actually think that's a super interesting maybe call for I don't know, maybe taking a kind of liberty in manifesting the ritual, or perhaps maybe in saying that ritual is a part of creating history in architecture, right? I think in a lot of ways, I kept thinking about make new histories, and that has stuck with me since the last, you know, in a way, the kind of biennial proposal has sort of stuck in my head for a while, and I think it will continue to kind of stay there, especially in a moment in history when we're sort of literally watching things change around us, and in these weird kind of like virtual Skype lecture conversations, and at home, probably like, you know, in our pajamas, which is what may or may not be happening. But, you know, the idea that history is happening and the way that we ritualize it or physicalize it or spatialize it is actually a design problem, right? Or a design project, right? And maybe a problem is a project. But no, I think that this is actually quite interesting to maybe think about both of these projects in terms of ritual and how those things may or may not be embedded into a kind of history itself already. Yeah.
I mean, I guess the only thing I would, if I may, the only thing I would correct is just to say, well, history isn't happening, history is constructed. So like we're constantly, and this, you know, we're sitting here with 3 historians, just to be clear, like we're definitely outnumbered. So, but insofar as why we're even in this room with, I guess, 2 designers and 3 historians, is that I see our work quite similar in that we're constantly constructing both. Anyway, that's just kind of as an aside, perhaps, that history doesn't kind of like happen. It gets constantly written, rewritten, and constructed. And what happens, who knows? It's unclear, actually.
I think that's a really good relationship between history and construction, and then also all of you arguing today about the construction and the staging, the performance of the action of construction, which is historically minded, you know, thinking of your dolmens. Very good. I mean, it's pretty cool. Gia, I just have one question for you. Being a curator and being the director of M&A, this has probably been a very strange time for you. I don't know if you had a bunch of projects planned in the making in terms of exhibition that aren't happening or could be happening, but you don't know what they're going to be, and then how that shift might happen to a temporary virtual discussion, or whether you're going, you know, like, what's the plan? How is this shifting the conceptual ideas that you're planning already?
For us, well, we're taking a pause and not doing any programming. I mean, we're being very deliberate about the pause, meaning we don't feel a need to normalize the present day by trying to continue as business as usual. we've had a lot of discussions about what programming could look like outside of the physical installation or physical contact. At some point, I think we'll return to, being together again. And Emily has funny resources that most people don't know about. Like we have a terrestrial radio station in Burbank at 96.7, 97.6 K-gap. If you guys ever drive through Burbank, you should tune in.
Cool.
So we have different kinds of resources, but I think at the moment we're withholding from the need to be really productive, because I think, as Michelle's project points out, that the length of any exhibition is also the length of the labor that goes into exhibitions. And so that comes with a specific, let's say, cost. I also want to say Vincent Young has a question, who's a student. I don't know if you've seen his chat bar.
No. Let me.
I can read it out.
I'm bringing him in. No, you can.
Vincent, you should just ask your question.
Oh, hi. Hello.
Hi, Vincent.
Hi. Yeah, I really enjoyed this talk, and I think that maybe not about virtual, but I think as a student at SciArc and seeing both your works, it has made me less anxious about like possibilities of like my own work, and seeing that ordinary materials could be displayed and given attention. I think that was really helpful to see it. And I think that maybe the critique, my question, I can just read my question, but it seems that both projects suggest ability for anyone to build ordinary things. The critique could be against the need for the artifact to perform otherness. The goal is shelter. And maybe you guys can speak towards the ideas of the ordinary shelter. I don't know.
Can you explain what you mean by performing otherness? Because is there a kind of social or political dimension to? Maybe I misunderstand.
Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe the design process forces the conceptual notions towards like why this project needs to look a certain way, both formally or materially. And I think that maybe in both your projects, the wall and the dolmen, which is the roof, it grounds the conversation back to it can just exist as shelter from the outside. Does that make sense? Like it's not about the need to produce a narrative or argument to why something needs to look a certain way. Is that making sense? Or a building needing to have another argument for its existence.
Would you agree that different those in the profession, those in the kind of in the discipline, let's say, and those passing by the street would all have different readings or different understanding, like a different understanding of the projects, and that somehow they exist as shelter, but then they also might trigger other kinds of references and discussions and essays and in certain audiences. In other words, you can kind of like think of the expanded audience versus kind of niche and even smaller and smaller until you reach an audience of, let's say 5 or what we're now at 48, which is not bad, but that somehow the projects probably exist in very different realms.
Right, where the othering exists from the perspective of maybe many othernesses towards the project. So everyone approaches the project and has a different lens towards the project, and that's okay, versus like a very strong narrative of why it's othered, if that makes sense. Like the othering maybe comes less from the author, but it comes from the audience.
Vincent, what do you think is the other of their projects? Like, what is it other in counter to?
I think it's in Michelle, I think the need for materials perform in in one way, right? Like the building of a wall is duplicated or multiplied, and so the ways that othering could happen is
well, because usually when we say other, we don't mean it just in difference. We mean it in, you know, it's kind of political term that describes the production of a idea of a self through this figure outside of the self. So you constantly need the other in order to describe the self. So I think I'm just curious to know, like, if you're imagining there's an other in their projects, what do you imagine as the core? What is the other reflecting, or what is the other describing as a central core? Does that make sense? So, I mean, I don't know if that's I'm sorry, I'll stop talking.
No, I think that for me, it's the projects can be read. The core is not the artifact. The core is the documentation. And so the artifact allows for the othering exists maybe more in the artifact, but I think that my question is more towards maybe my understanding that the project that, like the current, you know, structures that for construction pushes you know, an accelerated efficient way of constructing, and so many of these things use the same ordinary materials, but it needs to push a narrative to its consumers, or some sellable otherness. Like, I guess not sellable. Like,
can I help you out?
Yeah. I don't know if I'm saying. I'm just like.
Yeah, no, because I think you started somewhere, and like maybe you're getting a little. Yeah. So, but thank you for your question, which is like maybe to unravel a little. On one hand, you're talking about skill, right? That anyone can do it, and on the other hand, you're talking about a referent. The referent, and I'm more interested in the second part of the question, less so in the first, having to do with like expertise and whether projects are imaging expertise or not. But I think that like the second having to do with like what is the referent when you're using common materials, and whether that becomes either, if you're talking about a political project, or whether that becomes why you use common materials, I think is an interesting topic. So for me, the common materials and the common construction is not just based on efficiency or cheapness. It's to resonate with something that exists in the like common American vernacular, for lack of a better term, that we understand very well. Drywall, mudding, all these like super Home Depot products, in order to understand their strangeness. So for me, I hope I'm not making ordinary things. I think it's like a pretty weird thing. I think honest thing is a pretty weird thing, but that's why I love it. But we register that through the lens of like common materials, or the ways in which we expect those to behave, and then they're behaving in unexpected ways, I would say.
So we have another question, because we're going to move this a little bit. So Aubrey, do you want to talk?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Hi, it's so nice to see all of your faces. And hi, Debbie. It was nice to hear your voice too. Yeah, this is great actually, because I did want to return back to the Ding dong. Am I still talking?
Now you are.
Okay. So we've been talking about like practice and, you know, standard materials and those kinds of choices that both of you have made. But I want to talk about an adjacent quality that I think characterizes a lot of these conceptual projects, these institutional projects, which is like cost. Like, you know, there's only a certain amount of budget that like a gallery or an organization can gather together. And, you know, as a result of architecture at least being valuable enough for some people to spend, you know, $20,000 to $100,000 building a conceptual, non-quote functional thing. Oh, I lost the train of that sentence. Okay, anyway, so that's the kind of like budget that most of these projects kind of exist in. And in order to execute something at that budget, like, I feel like I've occupied many different roles in a lot of these different projects, and it seems like it forces you to pick one thing, you know, like you pick the SIPs or you pick the other thing, or you pick the labor or the other thing. And so it kind of forces a kind of specification and kind of intense focus on one aspect of practice in a very productive way. So I guess what I would like to say is that I think the production of the things outside of the object itself, being the research, being the accumulation of knowledge that comes out of that kind of deep investigation, I would like to propose that instead of maybe taking architecture out of circulation, referencing back Gia's sentence education to me about 70s conceptual art and institutional critique, you know, rather than taking these kind of documents, taking architecture out of circulation, I feel like it puts it into circulation in a funny way. Like, these objects are already out of circulation in some ways. Like, they are not real estate. They are not like big, you know, architectural objects, regular architectural jobs. Like, it's out of that market. But I would have to say that, you know, these kind of projects are very like convenient for producing texts, for producing your lectures, for producing, you know, very amazing, like beautiful specification, like manuals that you can take home from an opening. And so, you know, given that there's maybe a consonance between conceptual work and texts and institutions, I guess I would wonder, like, what would you do with these projects with like a bigger budget? like what would happen if, you know, it wasn't so constrained, if it wasn't so limited to these small gestures? Because it actually seems to me like there's a very happy ecosystem between these objects, the kind of archives that they produce, and then the people who are, you know, authoring them. And it seems like maybe, you know, the budget is one thing that is always a frustration, but is it really? I guess that's my question. That's my take on the critique. Is that good? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I think it's a really good question, especially the one around what would you do, but at the same time, your question sort of like breaks my heart, which is that it suggests that I don't know, there's something that it's like the defining of architecture markets, that what we do is like so niche. I don't know, like to me, like it's all building. Small building is still building. Like a limited budget project is a full-on architectural project to me. I think bigger budget means more complicated client relationships and more legal codes for sure. But I don't necessarily think that there is such a direct relationship between money and market and the depth of the work that you do. I don't totally think you're making that statement.
Yeah,
but
no.
I think maybe implicit, I sometimes think like with the conceptual versus the real definition of installation versus building, there is that division. And so what if we thought about it really as every one of these is an instantiation of a real architectural project instead, is what I'd advocate for.
Maybe it's not about depth, but about the term circulation, Aubrey, that you're using. And I'm thinking that on the one hand, we could talk about the 1970s conceptual project and institutional critique, but we could also speak about, say, the architect critic who teaches. And, you know, that I think that's what you're implying, maybe, Aubrey, that there's some sort of idea that it may not be a market in that sense of the term, but let's say that things circulate potentially as forms of knowledge, or, you know, as you're saying, Aubrey, like lectures, or that, you know, that there's an idea that if you write about your work and you theorize your work and you teach and you practice as well, but this is, you know, you've both cited Eisenman today, but I'm thinking about the architect critic or the artist theorist. So in that conceptual moment, there was not just that you're producing work, but that you would write about how it should be received in a certain way. So maybe not just the critique of the gallery institution, but thinking about the academic institution as another place where things might circulate.
But just to play devil's advocate, because I'm totally on board with and feeling positive about all of this, but is architecture critic not like woman architect? I don't know. Like, does that make sense to you? That can it not? No, you don't think so.
I don't understand your
Steven.
question. I don't understand your question.
It's a like woman architect as being like you have to have a caveat for a specific kind of body of work, right? So like architect critic, I understand that architecture can like manifest in many different ways, but I guess all I'm trying to say is somehow I feel like there's an implied comparison to the real, like the mass market architectural project with the real client.
But you genderized it all of a sudden, so I'm trying to
because I'm putting it in the negative, I guess. Which is that I don't want to go ahead, sorry.
No, I'm trying to understand your use of gender because you associate it with critic, as far as I just. Yeah.
So I guess you know the saying, like, I don't want to. I'm an architect. I'm not a woman architect. I'm just an architect.
Yes, and that, right? And
yeah.
Kind of the,
yeah. So like the same thing. I think there's like I'm not an architect. I'm an architect critic.
Yeah. So you're saying there's a pejorative associated with being a critic versus being the great architect, right?
The builder who has a mass client, I guess. That's all I'm saying. And I think that's
I agree
real.
with you that there's an unfortunate history to that, and some people might believe in that. But I think, Michelle, what you pointed out was, I have built buildings, so I kind of know something about what you just said, is that when you're, and I used to be a conceptual artist, and I somehow got obsessed with making buildings. And when you're doing what you all are doing, you're actually quite provocative, and it's very interesting on many levels. But then when you get into the production of the real, there are a lot of things that come into play, that life safety and all the issues of codes and things that actually are intellectually important, and we can critique them and theorize them, but they also do shift in some ways the artistic aspect. And I think there's something really bold and wonderful that still happens in installation work that can't happen or it happens in the architecture, but sometimes just differently.
Well, Michelle, here, I thought of a rebuttal to my own question, and I think it'll be balm to your soul.
I'm gonna have to stop this.
Just as a further provocation, in that the archive of documents and kind of ephemera around a project is also what puts, quote, real architecture into circulation. So just to put it out there. I think there's also a consonance between architectural practice at both of those skills too. So I'm not trying to like lean into any one answer, and I do not think we should despair.
I guess maybe we should disclose the fact that Aubrey, you're working with Frank Gehry now, and extensive archive that office has produced is going into circulation now. I think one way I would have probably answered your initial question would have been that all of this institutional work is, of course, circulating through publications, and that has to do with all kinds of tenurability issues, etc. But also the idea of producing discourse and constructing history. So building these things and not writing about them is like not building them at all. But on the other, and that's what you've said. But the other thing that is hugely important for these institutions is the kind of way in which people begin to circulate through and in and out of these things. And by people, I mean quite literally people like you, Aubrey. You've circulated through numerous instances of these objects, and now are in a larger version of one of those things. And, you know, Gehry should have probably been in the room, or has been spiritually or whatever, simply because of the Broken Box project and being here in LA. So somehow maybe his office is a large scale version of this. And the fact that it's the most successful, still functioning and incredibly seductive magnetic space, place where even
yeah, but Anna, you could argue Frank has always made a point of not discussing his work or theorizing it, and so we had
that's to Aubrey's point. There is an archive that does that. It speaks, not that it speaks for itself, but it speaks through historians who will then produce exhibitions and writing on it.
I mean, I think Aubrey also has to disclose that she was on the committee that selected Michelle's project.
Sorry, I didn't disclose.
Oh.
He was on the programming council that was looking at the range of
I didn't totally get that.
Oh, sorry, yeah. You know, it was like a few, you know, a number of us, I mean, Aubrey, I don't know, you can correct me, but I think a huge conversation we had, starting with the selection, but also moving into the final exhibition, were these questions of, you know, in the process itself, Michelle's project was actually surprisingly the one with the clearest form, and the other two projects had a range of formal description that were really unclear as to the output, and it really challenged some of the, you know, it really brought to light the paradox of the curatorial brief and the nature of an open call, which is that if we're asking for a project with process and some kind of durationality and not wanting to center on this object, and yet at the same time, the open call in the structure of its, you know, the nature of an open call is this reciprocity where you expect some kind of product delivery. There was really a lot of questions about what would be the criteria of judgment. And that was the biggest debate that we had within the Contemporary Council, was how do you judge the projects according to the proposal? And Michelle's projects as a proposal had the most evidence of some kind of process. Others were, you know, they were all very different in their way. I don't know, Aubrey, you can jump in. And that really brought into, you know, and when I worked with Michelle and we all were talking with her about how she would exhibit her project, because it was so durational and insubstantial, and there was so much other forms of inscription of the project beyond the built work, there was a lot of discussion about, well, how do you exhibit, what do you exhibit? Like, where do you exhibit the labor of her project? Because it's not going to be that one day it was actually fulfilled, and you know, it was a performance, right? So for us, I think thinking about the way you exhibit work becomes kind of brings to light these questions of what about the ephemera of the work? Like,
Yeah.
Is the labor in the ephemera? Is the labor in the object? Is the labor in the perform? Like, how do you capture that in a way?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have to kind of wrap it up. I wanted to give Raphael a chance to talk because he's been waiting a long time. If I can unmute you. Can you speak?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead and ask a question, then we'll probably wrap it up.
Okay, cool. First of all, thank you for taking the time to do this lecture. So you all had the conversation with the importance of physical presence on the site, as well as the significance of photography. And not everyone can visit a site or building. So the use of photography nowadays is pretty much the initial interaction general audiences have with architecture. So do you think photography should be more provocative as depicting progress, as in like progress of construction, or depicting the final product?
It's a good question.
Well, I think in Michelle's project, it was documentation, post-performance.
Yeah.
Or performance documentation, let's say.
Yeah, so the photographer was Tag Christoph, who was wonderful. We had several conversations around this, how to photograph the project in such a way that didn't reveal too much of the finished object or the whole form. So I said a couple of things, like I really wanted him to document it in his own way as much as possible, but one, there's a schedule around the documentation. I mean, we kind of went nuts with the schedule. And then like two, like no wide angle shots. Three, how do you do a panorama in such a way that reveals the temporal quality of like a long shot? So that was totally in Tag's realm. And what I was super interested in with both Bob the builder, yeah, that's his actual name, and Tag the photographer, was to just ask them, in their professional opinion, this is the project, how would you best do it? And yeah, I think that was pretty productive in both of those relationships.
Okay, Anna, did you want to?
Oh, just to say, I guess we both showed pictures from construction today, and it's, you know, I guess we take most of our pictures with our phones, and then we kind of send them to each other, and I don't know, it just seems super productive. We were such a luxury that SCI-Arc asked Josh White to come in and actually photograph something on our behalf. It's kind of amazing. But we very rarely engage a professional photographer because it's quite an expensive enterprise. So I guess my sense is and maybe this comes back to the kind of question that Stephen asked about kind of design versus, or kind of, you know, different stages of design. But one thing that I saw quite a bit in the past was a kind of interest in the final product. And I think that had to do something with also the way in which students would kind of deliver that final product at the reviews. And now I do ask my students to show quite a bit of photographs from their kind of production and the labor that they kind of brought to all of the artifacts that they're showing through kind of documentation and kind of excessive perhaps documentation. And so even in the way in which we work in studio, I find it more and more helpful to actually disclose those moments that are kind of messy. Maybe because those are the moments of design rather than the moments of kind of finished, smooth and shiny stuff. But I would say that you kind of need to have both. Like, I mean, this is maybe to Gia's point that Michelle's project had form, but also had intention of construction. Like, I'd like for work to have both of those things, that they can be understood as both finite and a little bit infinite at the same time, as process and as product.
Well, thank you. This was a lot of fun for our first shot at this. So Sarah, thank you for organizing. Thank you for imagining this conversation. It was really, really terrific. Michelle, Anna, Gia, really appreciate having you and being part of this and hearing your conversations. And I actually love your work, so it's all good.
Thank you.
All of you out there who we didn't get to see visually, thank you for joining us today. And we have French 2D on Thursday. Timing will be shifting. It'll be 4 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. We'll have lectures every Thursday, so hopefully more will participate. We got a lot of people here though for very little advertising, so very
it's a good turnout.
Yeah, really cool. Okay, thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
You have a great night.
Thanks.